Welcome to Artificiality. This is Dave Edwards.
And Helen.
We have a fantastic conversation recorded with Rana el Kaliouby, the CEO of Affectiva, about their emotional AI products and about her new book, Girl Decoded. But before we get to that conversation, talk a little bit about news coming out of IBM today, that they are no longer offering general-purpose facial recognition software. It's a technology that we've talked a lot about, you've written quite a lot about. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think this is really interesting, and because it's really the first time that we've seen someone sort of pull back from product strategy. Others had not gone into it, but I think that what we're seeing is very much a response to some of the backlash last year around Clearview AI and around recognizing that there's a pretty strong link between overusing some of these technologies or using them in ways that people don't necessarily realize is happening, and this loss of personal freedoms and obscurity and privacy that can sort of creep up on us. And obviously recent events have sort of fast-tracked some of this stuff, but it's still, the conversation started last year. That's really what we have to remember. It is important to remember that this is not a conversation that's just started in the last few weeks. The announcement actually came out in the form of a letter to Congress, where IBM was demonstrating support for new legislation, the Justice and Policing Act that came out. It was interesting to me to read the letter and have IBM open with a reflection back to the Thomas Watson's stance supporting civil rights in 1953. So this is, IBM taking quite an historical view in representing their stance on policing, on increasing justice, and in smart use of technology. Yeah, in many respects, it's sort of the ultimate test of ethics is whether you will back away from something.
Sure.
Now, this was a pretty small part of their business.
Yeah.
But it's an important piece of the technology landscape, and to say you're not going to go into that space it carries a lot of weight. Yeah,
and I like that there was in Axios, Axios reported that one of the IBM spokespeople said that this was a decision that was made quite some time ago, and that they've been communicating with customers, but this is the first time they've publicly announced it. What was interesting is that they have said that they will continue to support some of their previous customers, which you'd expect for IBM, but that they are no longer going to create any new updates or any new products in facial recognition. So it's clearly a space where they had a product, as you say, and it's interesting that they back away from it. We haven't really seen that before, and I think it does make a big statement when a company the scale and size of IBM, with such a huge push on AI and Watson in general, says, you know what, this is an area that we actually don't think is right to be in.
Because it's quite sweeping, and it plays nicely to the conversation that we have with Rana, who is really pretty unique in the technology space.
Yeah, she is.
She'll describe some of her background in the conversation, but there aren't really very many people who have the sort of depth of experience and background that she brings to technology development. And she's really clear that they made similar decisions and still make them.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really struck me in the conversation, is that she talked about backing away from and turning down business for ethical reasons. And I think you're right. She stands out in that respect in the industry. I'm sure there are other companies who may make similar decisions, but she's really out there calling for it, and I find that to be impressive.
Yeah, and it relates a lot to how we think about designing AI systems. We're right up front. One of the very first things that we talk with people about is what are your intentions for this, but also what are the consequences, because you need to own those as well. And almost technology companies are almost starting to that's the line in my mind that's starting to happen. You're either concerned about both, or you're only concerned about one.
Yeah.
And because the design of these AI systems is the behavior is of the AI system is relying on its post-design experience to a certain degree, and is dealing with behavioral things that, human behavior in ways that we've never done that before and operate outside our conscious awareness. There is no, in our view, view where you can step back and say consequences don't matter anymore. You actually, as a designer, you have to own both the intent and the consequences. And I think that's the line we're starting to see, is how I sort of divide it in my mind. If you only care about the intentions and you're not caring about the consequences, then you're on one side of that line and others are on the other side.
Yeah.
It might be overly simplistic, but it's a useful way of charting the technology landscape from my perspective right now.
I agree. All right, well, let's get on to the conversation with Rana, which was a real pleasure for us, and hope you enjoy it. Okay, well, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you start off by giving our listeners a bit of background on Affectiva and how the company came to be as you spun it out from MIT and where you've gotten to today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rana el Kaliouby. I'm co-founder and CEO of Affectiva. We are an MIT venture-backed spin-out on a mission to humanize technology by building artificial emotional intelligence technology. We use deep learning and machine learning and computer vision to essentially build algorithms that can read and interpret people's facial expressions and map those to a number of emotions, but also tie in things like gestures, behaviors, vocal intonations to really get a holistic understanding of the person's state. Many applications of this technology, a lot of ethical and moral implications, of course, and I'm excited to have a conversation around those.
That sounds great. I mean, one of the things that we've been studying emotional AI for a long time, and it's fascinating to see how people's interpretation of what machines should do and what machines could do to help humans has changed over the last few years. And part of that's popped up because of a better awareness of bias. Mm-hmm. And so bias in image recognition or in anything that involves the human face seems to be something that people are particularly sensitive to. How's your journey gone through that? Where did you in 2016 versus now? What was the sort of journey that you personally took through that? Was that somewhat of a revelation, or did you know this kind of stuff coming into it? How's the nuance for you developed?
So I've been in this space for over 20 years now, and it all started with my PhD at Cambridge University, where I built kind of a very early version of an emotionally intelligent system that can just leverage any webcam and interpret the underlying facial expressions. Now, that was back at the time when webcams were big and blurry and slow, and, machines were not really equipped to do a lot of this processing. But still, I was really cognizant that for this algorithm to work accurately, it needed to be trained on a very diverse group of people, and diversity cuts across gender, ethnic backgrounds, as well as age. But even things like people who wear glasses and people who don't, people who wear the hijab, which I did for many, many years, and people who don't, people who have facial hair and people who don't. So it's really a matter of how diverse your data is. And I've always given an example. If you're teaching a kid to recognize an apple, you want to expose them to red apples and green apples and all sorts of apples, right? And it's the same really with machine learning. The more examples and the breadth of these examples you're able to train the algorithm with, the more accurate and robust it's going to be. So for me, it's really been a long journey, and it's very front and center for what we do at Affectiva. We think and implement ways to mitigate against data and algorithmic bias.
Yeah, well, it also, that also speaks to what diversity means in terms of like an implementation team, right? Or choosing just the actual people around the table. How do you talk to your customers about that?
Absolutely. I think the only way to avoid accidentally building bias into our algorithms is to ensure that the teams that are designing, developing, and deploying these AI systems are diverse. And for us, this is very personal for me because, I'm a Middle Eastern woman who was running an AI company. So I'm very much in the minority, and I am a huge advocate for bringing diversity around the table, not just gender diversity, but again, all sorts of perspectives. The more perspectives we have, the better, because we all have our own blind spots. We design for what we know. And the more voices we have around the table, the more likely we ensure that it works for everybody. And I have these specific examples. Like, we do a lot of work in the automotive industry. And one time we were working with a European luxury brand automaker, and they sent us a data set to test our algorithms. And it was literally like, a very homogeneous set of, blue-eyed, East European, middle-aged guys. And I looked at the data and I said, we can test this and the results will look great, but that is really not representative of their consumer base. They're a global automaker. So we went back to them and we said, we ought to really go back here and let's collect a more diverse data set and test for that to ensure that we are, that we're equally accurate across different, facial configurations and facial colors and backgrounds.
How much do you think that perspective comes from an individual's experience? So I bring up an example pretty often of when I tried using Kate Crawford's excavating AI project, and I put my face into it, and it responded back that it labeled me as a creep and a weirdo. And as a generally middle-aged, normally white guy, right? I'm not used to having, having that response from a system like most of them are tuned to accurately represent me, but also not to have negative labels, right? That's kind of it was unusual. I've always been aware of bias. We've written about it and talked about it for years, but having that personal experience changed my point of view. Do you think that that's accurate for other people as well, or is it just me?
No, I think that is accurate for other people. I think if you've experienced it, it becomes a lot more real. And I think, I think at Affectiva, we want to make sure that every person around the table has a voice. Another example is we have a team of data annotators back in Cairo, and a lot of them are young women who wear the hijab, and their job is to watch videos of people making expressions and annotate those. And one time they said, we've been labeling for months now, and we have yet to see anybody that looks like us in this database, right? Totally unintentional, but only they could flag it, right? Because it reflected kind of their experience. So I really think, I think personal experience plays a huge role there.
Yeah, and especially when you're dealing with a labeled data set, the personal experience gets represented in the data. So for some reason, our theory is that the labeling that came through and the labeling for my picture had something to do with the fact that I have facial hair, and that there's some archived history in ImageNet that had some negative connotations for men with facial hair. But other than that, it just turns out to be something that's sort of amusing for our children, that I got, a weirdo.
But it also highlights how, if we're not careful, we just unintentionally build in all of the biases that exist in society. We just build them and replicate them in these algorithms, and then, lo and behold, deploy them at scale, right? That's a really big issue. And so we really have to think through the unintended consequences of all of these technologies and be proactive about it.
Yeah, well, that's something that we think an awful lot about, the unintended consequences, because some of them are truly unintended. They're quite surprising, but many of them are pretty obvious in hindsight. They're things that have they're fractures or divisions that are already there in society, and they just get amplified and pulled apart by AI. Do you think that emotional AI, the stakes get raised further, or is it just the same as anything else?
I think the stakes are higher because the data is so much more personal. right? And, our emotions drive almost every aspect of our lives and influence our decision making and influence how we connect and communicate with one another. So you could totally imagine scenarios where this data could be used to manipulate people or discriminate against people. So I think we have to be extra careful. Again, at Affectiva, and it's actually one reason why I wrote my new book, Girl Decoded, is I wanted to talk about these unintended consequences and highlight them so that we can be proactive and even advocate for thoughtful regulation so that we can really focus our efforts on things that matter, like the application of emotion AI to mental health or autism or automotive, but then guard against applications where you could manipulate the data in political debates or political kind of spheres or surveillance and lie detection. So I really think the public needs to be part of that conversation. And I think the average consumer really should have power in terms of making a decision. Does this company have ethical guidelines by which it abides to or not?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. When I was doing the bias work for courts earlier this year, one of the things that came up consistently was that a concern that a lot of good applications of AI could get stalled out because of the bad applications of AI, which is kind of what I hear you say. If mental health is obviously an extremely sensitive use case. So if you can't prove that you can manage the bad applications and apply it ethically in those and where intentions are so important, but consequences aren't necessarily easy to see, that there's a role for regulation and at least providing some sort of scaffolding around how people are supposed to think about those things, even if it's providing consumers with ways in which to actually think their way through this stuff rather than just sort of hit a button and feel disempowered right from the start that they've given up a choice or decision when they didn't even know there was one to be made.
100%. I 100% agree with you. I would hate to see the entire field of emotion AI squandered. But I really do think that because, again, back to like applications around mental health where we can really transform how we measure and diagnose mental health disorders, that is so powerful and transformative. But at the same time, there are so many ways this could go wrong. And it's incumbent on, the folks like me who are AI innovators and thought leaders and are at the forefront of this to have the conversation and to really be advocates for thoughtful regulation. So we're part of the Partnership on AI Consortium, which was started by a number of tech giants, as well as ACLU and Amnesty International. And then a number of startups have joined it as well. And we sit around the table and it's this amazing conversation with multi-stakeholders who we wouldn't ordinarily as technologists interface with, right? So we get enormous pushback from ACLU and other civil liberty organizations. But in my opinion, it's incredibly important dialogue that we have to have. And there are core values that we abide to as a company that I think are relevant, like data privacy. Everything we do is based on consent. Transparency, right? So when you consent to turn the camera on, we make sure that the consent is just written in plain English so that you can really figure out, okay, camera's going to turn on, who's going to use the data, where is it going, like all of these basics. So these are all like core values that I think need to be part of the solution.
Yeah, well, because some of the Affectiva demonstrations are pretty fun. And, we occasionally we do work with high school and middle school students. Mm-hmm. And that's a fun one. They like those demos.
Yeah.
But it's been interesting to watch them when you first get them to like pull it up. They're all very sensitive to we want to access the camera. They're very sensitive to that, much more than we see in adults when we do the same kind of work. So there's this up and coming demographic that is already sort of hyper aware of when their feelings can be taken from them, if you like.
I think that's great, right? We have an annual Emotion AI Summit, and last year I moderated a panel with kids. So we had an 11-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 16-year-old. And I was just blown away by these kids. They talked about power asymmetry, how a small number of organizations and governments have access to most of the data, and they felt that there needed to be a rebalance of that power. I was like, what? That's amazing. They talked about transparency, how like they click on all these agreements and they don't really know what they're signing up for. Absolutely true. We as adults have just kind of been normalized to this behavior, and they're like, why should this be the case? And so I was just really fascinated to your point about how these kids are a lot more sophisticated.
With one group, we ran the Stealing Your Feelings demo, the Mozilla Snap. I don't know if you've played with that.
I have not.
Oh, it's fantastic!
It's brilliant.
Created by the Mozilla Group, and it's showing you the data that is gathered about you when you use Snapchat.
And it's very much for an audience of teens and younger. And so they ask you things. It feeds back to you that you like pizza and that you have this gender bias. And some of it gets quite personal quite quickly. And when we ran it for the first time, that it came out as we were running a high school class. And these kids literally said at the end of it, I think I'll use Snap just a bit less now.
I don't let my kids. I'm pretty pro technology, obviously, but I draw the line at Snapchat.
If you play with that demo, you might actually be even more reinforced in that point of view. I mean, it is really fascinating, and it's wild to watch kids actually understand what the computer's seeing of them.
Yeah,
and what they're actually gathering. So I'm curious. As consumers, we can experience Affectiva through the demo. But you obviously have businesses where the technology is embedded inside something else, right? For instance, in a car. How do you engage with those companies in terms of with these questions around bias and their data and how it's represented and what their transparency is and where what the thing that should show up on the dash of the car to say yes, the camera's watching me. Are you passive as a technology provider because there isn't much you can really do about it, or do you take an active role in that?
We take a very active role in that, and I feel like we kind of created and coined the term emotion AI, and we seeded this market. So I feel like we have a real responsibility to shape what it looks like. With our partners in the market research industry, where we are in 90 countries around the world, we work with 25% of the Fortune Global 500 companies. From the get-go, we said, we are not going to engage with any business with you if you're not willing to put a very clear consent. It has to be opt-in. It has to be very clear that we're recording the video and what we're going to use it for. And so far, we do turn business away. Like we routinely get approached by folks who want to use our technology in surveillance or lie detection, we've turned millions of dollars of business away. And then in automotive, none of the data gets recorded; it just processes on the fly. And we are in active conversations with car makers on how to ensure that consumers know that there is a camera in the car. And again, recognize, what is the extent through which the data is being analyzed or processed. And then with bias, again, active conversations. It's through like this car company that sent us the very homogeneous set of data. It's like, it's a continuous dialogue. It's very easy for a company to just be passive and just, it would have been really easy for Affectiva to just test this data set and score 100% accuracy and be done and just get the business. And we went back and we said, we could do this, but that's not the right thing to do. Hey, guys, this data set needs to be a lot more biased. Let's go back, collect more data, analyze it, and show you the real results. So I would my call to action to other AI companies is to really take that proactive approach.
Which isn't necessarily happening. I mean, I think you're the first person that we've talked to in the AI space and best part of half a decade that said that they've turned business away because of a particular use case.
Yeah.
Who's explicitly said that. And particularly with things that are using facial recognition in some form, there seems to be a pretty solid pattern of not owning the use case development and not owning. I mean, the big one that stands out is Amazon, where they really don't care at all what it's used for. It's totally up to someone else to decide. That sounds like you're really at the other end of that philosophy.
Yeah, we have. I mean, at some point in time, in 2011, we were approached by the venture arm of an intelligence agency. They wanted to give us, almost $40 million of funding, but the condition was to pivot to do more surveillance work. And that was just not in line with our core values. And in fact, we were about to run out of money as a startup. So I didn't even know if we turned this money away, if we would be able to raise money elsewhere. So it was a real existential threat. But we stood by our core values, turned that away, and were able to raise venture money elsewhere with investors that shared our core values. I think it's really critical that AI thought leaders really take a leadership position here, because if we don't and just take the position that, let the legislators figure it out later, I think that's not going to work.
When we think about bias, the next thing that we sort of think about is explainability. So how does that get explained? And then the justifiability. What's the justification behind it? What's Affectiva doing in terms of the unique requirements for explainability around emotional analytics? And further from that, how are you thinking about being part of developing the science for expression analysis? And there's been some controversy over the last few years about the scientific justification for taking an expression and turning that into what someone actually feels.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how you see those few steps?
Yes. Let's start with that, with that kind of controversy first. So what you're referencing is basically the body of work. So in this emotion AI space, there's this oversimplification that a single expression maps to a single emotion. So for example, if you smile, you are happy. If you do a brow furrow, you are angry. And this one-to-one mapping is totally naive and it's unrealistic. You just need to spend a few seconds and you would realize that, right? Because I might be smiling, but I may not be happy. I might be smiling for a lot of reasons. In fact, there is documented examples of anger smiles, flirtatious smiles, sadness smiles, empathy smiles. So, or when you frown your eyebrows, maybe you're angry, but maybe you're confused, maybe you're constipated, right? So it is really important that we recognize that this is a really complex problem, and this one-to-one mapping is overly simplifying the situation. So at Affectiva, we do that. We kind of have the building blocks, which are the facial expressions, and then we have another layer of mapping, which puts into consideration context, temporal information, like how does your expression unfold over time, and even adding other modalities like voice.
I think it's a fascinating area because in all fields of AI, when you start to see the original naive cases bump up against where the science doesn't necessarily support it, and people are much more motivated to actually have an interdisciplinary conversation. So one of the things that I saw that I've been watching happened after that 2017 paper that was released with the meta-analysis was that people from fields that weren't AI, more psychological fields or other, neuroscience fields, sort of stepped in to start to fill in more gaps around that and say, well, this is more about context. Mm-hmm. This is more about the temporal aspects, the tone, the position someone's in, all sorts of things. And but then, of course, the next thing that happens after that for an AI company is, well, how do you gather all of that extra data and still be true to keeping a relatively simple interface, to making it really explainable, and to not invading people's privacy even further. So this sort of paradox that comes up, this paradox of autonomy, where you want to be able to provide better information, but it involves more and more data collection.
It definitely involves more and more data collection. So in our case, we send out what we call the Affectiva driver kits. So a combination of cameras that we ask people to install in their vehicles, and then we record people's driving, their daily commutes for a few weeks. And that gives us real naturalistic, spontaneous driving data. So that's been really powerful. The key takeaway there is that, context matters. So when we see, people's eyes kind of drooping, your head's bobbing, you're tired, right? Because we know you're driving. And in that context, that is kind of the levels of drowsiness unfolding right in front of us. So it's really important to incorporate not just the expressions, but your head movements, other objects that you're interacting with. So if I'm holding a phone and you can see me looking up and down, gazing up and down, then guess what? I'm texting while driving, right? And that's a dangerous behavior. So I really think the solution there is to collect this multimodal data set. It's very expensive. But it's also a key competitive advantage. So the companies that can figure out how to get that data are going to be ahead.
So if you're making a much more complex assessment than what the research was sort of highlighting or debunking, if you will, that a simple smile means you're always happy. You're taking much more into context. That to me feels like the ability to explain your analysis is also much more complex. Right? It's not a simple, we think you're happy because you're smiling. There's a lot more that you're doing in there to think about it. How do you think about that process of explaining the analysis and justifying the conclusion that you've made? That someone is, for instance, texting while driving or feeling drowsy or whatever the analysis is.
Yeah, we often look at do a little bit of introspection into what the neural networks are learning. And we also do a lot of data synthesis work, right? So you can basically train an algorithm and then take that algorithm and superimpose it on, say, a neutral face and regenerate examples. And that allows us to kind of see, okay, what did this algorithm actually learn? So that's an area that we're doing a lot of work in, also because it allows us to augment our data set. So that's really powerful as well. But I mean, in this whole space, whether it's about mitigating bias or explaining the underlying AI, this is all very new territory. So when I was a PhD student, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, there was no way to do all of that. You just reported one accuracy score, right? And now that's not good enough. We now have to break the results by different groups and really try to kind of put a spotlight on how it does at a microscopic level, which was not really the case a while ago. So I think as a field, we're figuring out how to reduce all of these things to practice. We're at the forefront of that. We're really prioritizing that. We also try to talk about this publicly because we feel like sharing notes and comparing notes is really how we move forward faster.
Are there any emerging use cases for Affectiva that you're really excited about?
One use case that is kind of happening or accelerating because of COVID-19 is the space of video conferencing and how people are connecting virtually. So, for example, as people give webinars, you don't really see the reaction of the audience the way you would if you were in a live auditorium. Well, Emotion AI can capture these live responses and visualize them in a way that creates more of a sense of a shared experience. This has applications in online learning as well.
Would have liked to have that last week.
Can we have one of those soon?
Yeah, we were giving we gave a guest lecture for a university course last week, I think it was, and there were only a certain number of students. I mean, only some of them had their video on, but you could only see a few of them at a time while you're giving a presentation. and you just feel like you're talking into to yourself, and it's really hard to figure out whether you're connecting with someone, whether anybody's listening, whether they're lost, when you say something that lights them up, or if you could find somebody who you think they're interested in paying attention, and then call on them to ask a question, because they might be kind of introverted and not wanting to put their hand up. There's so much of that interaction that, we're used to doing a lot of this live, giving talks and running workshops where you feel the room. And in the video, it's like there's only the room here to feel like.
Well, yeah, it's the experience of being completely starved of feedback, and you realize how much just simple expressions and simple emotional feedback actually provides so much rich information as to how you're being perceived. And it's when we've run virtual workshops, it's even tougher. Because you really need to be able to call on people and kind of keep the room energy up, and it's very tough to do without having that sort of instant read of emotion. And in fact, we've been asked to look at all sorts of things like apps that give you this emotional feedback. And every time we run a session in corporates, the number one thing that people want to actually experiment with is emotional AI. Yeah. Across all of the others, it's always the one that everyone chooses. So we're quite attuned to how much this deep interest in having more technology support for emotional engagement.
Absolutely. Can I bring you along with my pitches?
Yes, you certainly can.
Awesome. That was exactly like the pitch right there.
We totally understand the use case. We get it, and really, it is. It should. And I think Helen's right. Is when we're dealing with corporates who are actually trying to figure out how to build, an app for their business, or when we've done things with students, and part of what we take them through is a design process of how do you design an AI product or app. In so many of those cases, there is a desire to include some sort of emotion AI in it. That's what they're really reaching for and hoping for, and putting it into that is where they kind of they get so excited. That's what's exciting to them.
And people get pretty creative. I don't know what your research and product development lines look like, but the more we put this sort of stuff out, the more that people get quite creative around things like generating haptic feedback off of an emotional signal. That's a very popular place for people to start thinking about, integrating with an Apple Watch and giving you a buzz when people are feeling certain things, and they want that coaching.
Yeah, I think we're all craving this sense of a shared experience, and it's really hard to replicate that in a virtual environment. And I believe that, I'm very grateful for platforms that like Zoom and others that allow us to connect. But I think we're going to see a whole layer of innovation that sits on top of it, that integrates technologies like emotion AI that allow us to provide real-time feedback, but also post-analytics that can be really, really actionable and powerful.
One of the things that we've been interested in over time is the role of unsupervised learning techniques or semi-supervised learning techniques that can reveal things about humans that are outside of our conscious awareness, or things that we don't even know about ourselves, just general pattern recognition. Have you seen interesting things come out in the field of emotional AI like that?
Yes. So about a couple of years ago, we did an unsupervised kind of data mining experiment where we looked at about 2.5 examples of smile expressions from all around the world. And we were able to identify at least 6 different types of smiles based on the temporal dynamics, but also like what other expressions are activated in addition to kind of the typical mouth expressions that are involved in a smile. And it was just really fascinating. Like, we found that in Asia, there tended to be this like really, really subtle expression, which I think is more of a politeness smile. It's a social politeness smile. And that tended to happen a lot more in Asia. So I do think that with enough data, we're able to uncover kind of more nuanced expressions that maybe we're not able to do before.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting promise for AI overall, is what else can we learn about ourselves, especially when that gets fed back to someone in some sort of learning cycle.
So you've just come out with a book, and quite interested to hear just to share a bit about what the book's about and your sort of target audience and who you wrote the book for.
So the book is called Girl Decoded, and I published it mid-April. So it's, right in the middle of this global pandemic, which was quite interesting. We pivoted to an entire virtual book tour. So the book is a juxtaposition of emotion AI. What is emotion AI? Why do we need it? It takes the reader behind the scenes of how do we build AI like that and what are the use cases and applications. But at the same time, interwoven in it is my personal story. I grew up in the Middle East and found my way to Cambridge University and then came to MIT as a postdoc before starting Affectiva. And so I kind of talk very authentically and openly about my experience as a woman in the Middle East and now as a, tech entrepreneur in a very male-dominated society. And just, I wrote the book for, of course, people who are interested in technology, but more broadly, actually, just folks who are interested in forging their own path and they've struggled to find their own voice and embrace that. And so I hope it inspires a lot of people out there.
I'm sure you've had a lot of feedback on it, probably quite personal feedback with those two intertwined stories.
Yeah, I've really, this is my first book, and I found that the book is almost like the beginning of a journey. It's a conversation opener. So I've built so many new connections with people from all over the world. And it's just this deep, because I'm so open in the book about my personal experience, it invites people to reciprocate. And so I've built this like really interesting, deep, authentic connections with people I would have not maybe met ever. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, I read a huge number of AI books. If it's got AI on it, I'll read it. I can't think of really any that are actually vulnerable, where people express any kind of sort of personal vulnerability other than the fact that they failed to complete an equation or something.
Yeah, because most of them are business oriented or technical oriented, but also the journey for people through AI is not. It's not obvious that it is emotional or that it is human centered. And which is where we focus so much is this extraordinarily powerful technology. But what does it mean to us as humans? And so, I feel like we feel like we've got some form of connection with you as well, and that you're taking this as very much like your whole approach to the technology is about making it work for and with humans. Exactly,
it is. The technology is really cool, but at the end of the day, it's about humans first, right? Yeah. You put the human first. Yeah, absolutely. And I really wrote the book. It's not at all for kind of an AI expert. In fact, I think AI experts may read this and feel like the science is simplified, but I really wanted to demystify what it means to build an algorithm. What does it mean to train a deep neural network, right? In plain English. And I really wanted to show people that it's not just you sit one time, you feed the thing data and boom, it works. It took a lot of iteration and a lot of fine tuning and a lot of failure. And then as a company, we grapple with what applications to focus on and where do we spend our mind share and how do we advocate for the ethical implications and applications of it. So I really want, because I feel like consumers need to have a strong voice in this AI dialogue, I wanted the book to be accessible to the general public.
It's a good read for business leaders as well, because people need to, deploying AI and wanting to use AI, because we know how powerful it is, need to actually understand that it is it's much more like training a human than it is writing code. You have to, it's a bit unpredictable how quickly it's going to learn. That is costly, that time, actually even understanding how to develop a quote and develop a costing for an AI system. And so people need to shift their mindset to away from the technology to more of a much more less precise, fungible sort of process for them to come into AI with any sort of realistic expectation about what they're even asking the technologists to do.
Absolutely. And I think there's a skills gap there too, right? Like there's a lot of emphasis on the companies that are building the technologies, but often you have to partner with a company to deploy that AI at scale. And sometimes there's a skill gap because a lot of people on that receiving end don't really know what it means to deploy this technology, and how do you bring it into fruition in a way that works, at scale. And so that's an area where I think there needs to be a lot more work as well.
Yeah, well,
that's great.
That's excellent.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. It's been great. We're great fans of the work that you're doing. And so it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.